So let's take a look here. This is we're going to call an executive briefing. You may or may not be technically an executive, but what we find is that at the executive level, which is where a lot of this CSF and ISO speaks to, because what we're talking about here is policy procedure level. And it's a little bit different than the task level. So some folk may be versed in ethical hacking and forensics and those things. And that's embedded in what we discuss. But when you're at the executive level, so to speak, where you're the governance level, we're establishing policy and procedure. And that policy and procedure guides what happens at the operational and task level. So here, we're going to understand the intersection between cybersecurity and AI governance in particular. And to make this conversation digestible, we'll reference the two really preeminent standards for doing this, which is NIST, CSF, and ISO, as I mentioned to you, 42001. Now, before I go too far into this, I want to get over to show you something about NIST, and I believe I have it here. You may or may not be familiar with. I'm going to take it from the standpoint that many are not necessarily expert in this particular type of organization. But NIST is a mnemonic for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This came out very early on 1900s by the US Department of Congress. And what the deal was behind that is NIST itself is one of the oldest physical science laboratories that we have in the United States. And it was erected, if you look at this final paragraph, because the industrial competitiveness during the Industrial Revolution. So now we have an information revolution, and its significance is as profound and more important, even though not many people are familiar with or know about it. But if you look at this last paragraph, at the time we lagged behind the United Kingdom, Germany, and other economic rivals, and there needed to be a way to kind of add some standardization and to kind of fuel innovation so that everybody's aligned and on the same page, and to increase precision and the ability to measure performance in these scientific spaces. So NIST regulates not just or provides standards, which is really just best practices, but helps to regulate and guide us, not only in cyber, which is the chunk that we're going to bite off today, but electrical power grids, electronic health records. You can look in this second paragraph, atomic clocks, and these are just some examples. The list goes on and on and on. The whole idea is to provide some type of technological measures and standards that innovation can be guided by. So that's NIST in a nutshell. So we're not just throwing mnemonics out, and some may know and others may not. Again, the intersection between cyber, which is a big deal, AI, and we're approaching this conversation from the governance perspective. Oh, and by the way, I'm on the previous slide, I'm Dr. Mike Crawley and specialize in future work and cyber, not just NIST cyber, but again, it's such a big space. We just zoomed into my cyber, the NIST discussion of cyber, perspective of cyber for the sake of this conversation, so we can contain it. But yet, we do have a bit of an agenda. The introduction and purpose, a bit of an executive briefing. We just talked a tad about that. Why cybersecurity governance matters. Some know that, others, it's just a word, but it matters. The convergence of cyber and AI risk. We're going to use as our baseline the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and that's what CSF is. So those of you who know it, great, you're validated. Those of you who may not have heard it before, add that to your vocabulary, because when you're speaking in this topic of cybersecurity, it becomes critical that you understand what some of the frameworks and guiding documents and policies and procedures and standards, regulations, etc. are, so you can speak with some degree of insight and maybe even authority at some point in time. We're going to talk about a life cycle approach. And in this life cycle approach, let me go ahead and turn on my power to make sure my battery doesn't decide to conk out in the middle of our talk. And so for CSF, there's 6 core functions. We're going to talk about them. We're going to reiterate them so you'll be very much aware of them. Now, this is a deep dive, so there's no way you're going to become experts, so to speak, in the short period of time that we have here, but you will develop a degree of literacy about it. And so we'll spend a great majority of our time on that NIST. And then we'll introduce the concepts that are inherent in the ISO, International Standards Organizations 42001, which speaks very specifically to governance of AI at a global scope. Then we'll do a bit of a mapping between the two, the NIST CSF and the 42001. I say use case here, but it's just to give us some kind of context to which to apply this theory, I suppose is what a lot of it's going to be, are these standards and these principles. A bit of an implementation roadmap, some of the benefits and strategic value, call to action, and of course your Q&A. And we've got quite a few people there, so if you don't get to all of the Q&A here today, we'll just respond to those in the future. So the introduction and purpose. We've got about 21 slides here, so it's a bit of a dive, but at the same time, we get to it rather expeditiously. So there is a dual challenge to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity in and of itself is a bit to chew off on. And when you add artificial intelligence to it, particularly as rapidly as it's been innovating, growing, and expanding, it seems like every day you turn around, there's multiple new innovations that come out. It's enough to make the average person's head spin. And as you might imagine, that really injects a multiplicity of layer of cybersecurity concerns and considerations. And so we're here to make sure that this is something that you are sensitive and aware of so that you can be more proficient in the organizations that you engage in or are currently engaged in, and or those who you may decide to partner with ultimately. It's a very big topic. There aren't a lot of people who are addressing the convergence of this conversation, so you're in a very unique space. We thank you for your presence here to absorb this mindset. In so doing, we're going to introduce, as I said, the CSF 2.0, present 42001. It is a global standard for AI oversight, and explain the integration of the two so that you can be positioned for your ability to understand and even speak to a strategic roadmap and for executive and policymakers, because when you're at the governance level, that's where this conversation falls. So it puts you at the top of the food chain in terms of who you're conversing with, and the mindset that you have to kind of wrap yours around as you think about cybersecurity and with the infliction of AI, how critical it is and the way you need to be consider approaching it. Now, why is cybersecurity governance even an issue? Why are we even talking about this? Well, as you know, cybersecurity, if you don't have it, you open yourself up to a lot of potential threats, vulnerabilities, which can result in financial loss, reputational damage, legal liability, operational disruption, and the list goes on and on. So some of this, when you think about it, whether you have experience in cyber, in IT, or not, it makes sense to some extent. Now, connecting the dot a little more, these are all somewhat business risks that we talk about in this first line item. But cyber risk, which is a term that is familiar to some and new to others, can be equated to business risk. In other words, what we're exposed to in cyber the chance, the possibility, risk, the chance, the possibility, the likelihood of something occurring or disrupting business is opened up further because of cyber engagement. We're all interacting in cyber with cyber in some way, and that's becoming increasingly more true as the future of work becomes more preeminent. And so there's a direct relationship between risk that we may be exposed to with cyber and how that will impact or could impact business. Now, this should be a mindset that's thought of from the top down. So executives at both the C-suite and board levels must, I should have made that capital, ensure that oversight and resilience do exist in digital operations, which is interesting because, of course, typically executives and board are not involved deeply in operations. The CEO oversees it. But what happens at the executive level, governance, policy, and procedure impact how operations are carried on. So if this is not a mindset that is propagating itself from the top, you know, things roll downhill. It just means that what happens at those lower levels as you go down are going to be impacted. And typically, these decisions, it's thought that, you know, the computer geek or guru, the ethical hacker, the forensics guru, the audit folks, the people with the technical skills are the ones that have the answers. But why does cyber governance matter? Because what happens at those levels should be guided and influenced by business, strategic direction, mindset, values, priorities, and it needs to be policy and procedure needs to be set at that higher level so that everything that happens down at the lower levels where the keyboard punchers are doing their thing are moving in the correct direction with risk front of mind. So the convergence of cyber and risk. We're calling this a strategic framework for risk management and compliance, cyber risk, AI risk, all types of other risks. And as the AI adaptation expands, which it's doing exponentially, for anyone that hasn't been under a rock for the past 2 years, let's just say, maybe even going on 3, it's been longer than that. Matter of fact, Alan Turing, who is considered the creator of AI, his birthday was June 23rd. He was born in 1912, and when he brought the concept of AI, it was in the 1950s. So the idea of AI, artificial intelligence, from a technological standpoint, has been around for a long time. But in 2022, with ChatGPT and OpenAI's project, opened it up to those of the world who are not necessarily really technical geek type people, because it was a bit of a closed society before that. And it still remains relatively in that vein. But because of all of the tools that are coming to the consumer market, it makes the idea of artificial intelligence more relatable to more people. And that's going to continue to expand. As such, our attack surfaces, cyber term, in other words, our abilities to be exploited, also expand. And there are different types of attacks that become more prevalent, potentially, in this type of technological, emerging technology expansion. Some of you may or may not be familiar with these, don't worry about it, but adversarial attacks, data poisoning are very, very potentially common. And if you understand the anatomy of AI systems, many people who use AI are using it from a consumer standpoint. We're putting in a prompt and it gets a response back. That information is traversing a multiplicity of systems. And so whatever is being put in there is going out and is returning through these ecosystems. And there's a lot of vulnerabilities along the way, something we don't necessarily think about because we simply want the response to whatever prompt that we put in. But it's a very serious ecosystem, and there's a lot of vulnerabilities along the way, something that we want to keep front of mind. So AI adaptation is expanding rapidly, as do the attack surfaces in an exponential fashion. So that means that there should be, with this mindset, some consideration of regulations. There have been some. The European Union actually led the way with their AI Act. They were one of the first to really put something in writing. And this was very recent, too, just a few years ago. And then the US AI executive order followed. That was under the Biden-Harris administration. And then there are some things even the current administration has done to frame some conversation around it as well. But this is all still relatively new. And because of the adaptation and the expansion of AI solutions and things that are cropping up all over the place, the regulations are important, but they can't keep up with the expansion of technology, which is even why it's more important for us to have a mindset, and particularly for organizations, businesses, and their executive and board level thinkers, because to some extent, that decision-making body has to be ahead of the regulations, right? You don't want to wait until regulation it isn't there yet to be put in place while you and your organization remain fully exposed because there hasn't been given thought to governance ahead of a regulation maybe even coming out, but there are some there. And so as standards, we've got NIST, Cybersecurity Framework, and we've got the ISO. There's tons of NIST and ISO standards. There are others. There's acts. There's other regulations. There's a lot of little things floating around. None of it is comprehensive because this target is moving so quickly. However, narrowed it down to these two because they give you the most complete picture of any other combination that can come into play, because all others actually fall under these in some form. So just to give you an idea of where the separation comes in, why are we talking about NIST and ISO? The NIST framework focuses largely on cybersecurity risk management, which is a whole ecosystem in and unto itself. One of the things we'll do to you is share the, for those of you who haven't seen it, the framework. It's about a 32-page document, but it has links and propagations to other reference sources. So it turns out to be a very extensive body of work. And same thing with the ISO 42001. This is 2023, so it's the most current. The CSF, the 2.0 is the most current. That's one we're going to be referencing. But the ISO focuses largely on management systems, specifically AI management systems. So just to give you a bit of a distinction in why we're converging these in our executive discussion, the AI management systems doesn't necessarily put an emphasis on cybersecurity, and the NIST framework doesn't necessarily put an emphasis on AI. As a matter of fact, when the NIST framework was initially evolved, AI wasn't really a thing in the general public. So that wasn't a strong consideration. When the 4200, AI is the focal point of that particular standard. So that's pretty much all it's addressing. And so when we converge those, you have, you're better postured to be able to have a mindset for both of these very huge and important domains of cybersecurity and AI risk management. So both are foundational to what we call modern enterprise risk governance, which is a big deal. So let's just take a quick peek at this NIST cybersecurity. We'll look at NIST first. We already talked about the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, and it's for critical infrastructure. So not just IT technology, critical infrastructure. You saw on the history page that I showed there, there was even some talk about power grid systems. I mean, it goes on and on. And then there's this thing called quantum, which we're not going to talk a whole lot about today. But when we speak about cybersecurity, when you have a mindset around cybersecurity, there's no way you can leave out quantum. And this is actually an area that NIST, let me pop back over. It looks like I got sidetracked here a little. This is something that NIST has put a lot of emphasis is lately in particular is the quantum aspect. It's huge, whole world unto itself that is just unpacking. But also with NIST, it's a voluntary risk-based approach to managing cyber threats. When you have standards, the difference between standards and regulations, for those of you who may or may not be familiar, a standard is more of a best practice, where regulation is a must. You need to do this. And so voluntary is, since it's a standard, you don't have to do any of this, but it is recommended because some of these standards are really, really good. And it's built on, now, as I mentioned to you, there's a lot of standards out there. ISO, Internet Standards Organization, is huge on them. Many people are familiar with their 9001, which is the quality standard. That was one that many manufacturing organizations got their arms around very early on. But when it comes to cybersecurity, the 27000 family, and I say family because what's pointed out here in the third little point is the 27001, but there's 002 and the list goes on, because each of these cyber standards speaks to a specific domain of conversation around cybersecurity. Now, it just so happens that this NIST framework is a big emphasis on the 001, but it also speaks to some of the many others, and those are completely different conversations. COVID, another standard that's been around for a long time. And then NIST's SP 800 series, which is a whole, we should have actually had here, and I got this out of one of the ISO groups, we should have had the 27,000 series because there's tons of subcomponents to that, just like you have the 800, and there are tons of those. But each of those speaks to cybersecurity. And what we're saying about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework itself, the CSF, is that it is built on the foundations of its predecessors, which these are some of the primary ones, in order to produce this CSF. So it's built on solid ground. There are 5 basic functions. You'll see this again. Actually, there's a 6th one that's been added. Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Once you remember those, and as well as the 6th one, then you've got the gist of the framework. So this is now widely adopted across sectors of cybersecurity maturity because it really does a good job of zooming you in on the areas that we should focus on when it comes to this topic or conversation. So this is the gold standard. The framework's core we just talked about. You have the identify, and if you see, you look at this graphic that's here in the middle, this is what you'll see as the branding of the NIST CSF. It's the framework itself. We've got the 5 elements, components that we just talked about, those functions, let's call them. And we say they're identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And I told you there was a 6th. That 6th is govern. Now, in the previous version of the framework, govern was, even though this little illustration was always true, it wasn't necessarily considered a core element of the framework. But with the CSF, Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, which is the most current version, it expands beyond infrastructure because these 5 are all infrastructure driven. And as you looked at the history of the NIST really focuses primarily on infrastructure, whether it be technology, cybersecurity infrastructure, whether it be actual infrastructure of power grid systems, or the way cabling is laid, fiber optical cable, and the list goes on. But now this layer of governance is considered important. The scope has been expanded. This is now the gold standard, because governance, if you don't have governance, all your execution at these other functional levels can be all over the place. Even though you know what they are and how you should step through them, you have to have governance. And so now the scope has been expanded with 2.0. And so what the goal is here is you want to prioritize investments based on risk tiers. This is what we're empowered to do once we understand it from that perspective. Let's take a look at what these mean at a high level. And this is titled From Governance to Recovery. So here are the 6. So if you really want to be proficient, up to date with the CSF, there's 6 functions that we really want to be aware of. We know the 5 we talked about earlier: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Sometimes you might want to come up with a mnemonic to help you remember that. That would be IPDRR, but now it's govern at the top. That's new. It's been in my ecosystem for a long time, but NIST has also decided that it's important, which is good because everybody listens to NIST. GIPDRR, govern. Assign cyber risk with business goals. You saw in an earlier slide, we had the fact that cyber risk equals or equates to business goals. You want to make sure that the business goals is what the organization is around to realize, to achieve. That is the purpose of the organization, to realize these goals. But we have to have front of mind cyber risks. And so as we classify, and there's a whole approach to doing risk management, risk identification, and so forth. As we do that, we want to prioritize what are the higher value risks in conjunction with the goals of the business. There's no point in, if the goal of the business is to deliver products online, starting with books. And then, of course, when the book aspect of the business expands and becomes profitable, you can go to other products and services that you deliver. But essentially, let's say we have an e-commerce business, and the purpose of our e-commerce business is to deliver products and services to folks in an easy to access fashion. They can search what they want, etc. Similar to Amazon. So if that is the case, and there's a risk of a light bulb going out in the bathroom, that would be something that we'd be concerned about because we want people to be able to see when they go in the bathroom. But that doesn't necessarily rank high on the food chain in terms of accomplishing the business goals. It's there because you don't want people to not be able to see in the bathroom, but it's not on the same level of magnitude that if the server data center went out, or the power grid that feeds that center had a loss, the risk that is associated with that would be classified as higher, because if the data center that is housing all of these servers that allow this e-commerce business to take place, there was a risk that was a vulnerability that was exploited, and there was an outage there, or there was a power grid outage feeding that, then we'd have a bigger problem. That would interfere with the business goals in a lot more impactful way than the light bulb in the bathroom. So the alignment of the risk to the business goals is important. And that's where the governance comes in. Because if you leave it up to a bunch of technical gurus, the technical gurus tend to be driven by what is the flashiest shiny object that just came out and how shiny that object can be. So there would not necessarily be the prioritized by business goals. The prioritization may be, what is the coolest, shiniest object that I can play with today? So governance is critical, because at the governance level, this is an executive briefing, it is understood that the business goals are the driver, not the shiny object. But once we come into an agreement of that, we want to identify, because what you're doing in all cyber is you want to protect your assets. So we have to identify what these assets are. So we need an asset management system in place, or we should have one, and also a risk assessment to take place, again, in alignment with the business goals and the asset management. But as we trickle down, everything that we're doing here now has factored the business goals in, because we have that governance layer at the top. And the governance layer at the top is looking at ensuring that the business goals are what's being supported here. So when we identify our assets and we do our risk assessment, it is inherent that the business goals are the driver. Same thing as we move down the function list to protect. We want to make sure we have asset control there and awareness training. Now, here's a tidbit to take away with you. Do you realize that most vulnerabilities, most exploits are a result of human error? Now, technological is going to become more exponentiated because of AI and all of the elements that are introduced with AI and the technology and the layers that many end users are not aware of. And this is one of the reasons why the godfather of AI, Jeffrey Hinton, and others, Fifi Ling, she's with Google. She was also a Stanford person, and many others sound the alarm of saying, hold on, we're moving very fast with this AI. Maybe we need to stop producing consumable products just for the sake of profit and step back and understand our ethics and our infrastructure, because there's a lot of inherent risk there that we have not understood, explored, or aware of. That if we allow this thing to kind of propagate and morph itself on top of these unknowns, we may be really getting ourselves into a bind. So there is the balance between innovation and governance. But I say all that because awareness training is what we're talking about here. Human error is the biggest exploit in cybersecurity, but it's not trailed by too far with the infliction of AI and all of the unknowns there that are not talked about. That's another conversation. But then once we are protecting, because we have some access controls there, there's no 100% lockdown. That's another thing to understand about security, cybersecurity anyway. No 100% guarantee. So we know that some things can get through, particularly as I mentioned to you with the advent of quantum, because quantum computing takes the conversation to a completely different level, and that's a whole nother conversation to be had. But it's difficult to protect against quantum attacks because the technology that's currently in play isn't up to par. The classical computing, the digital computing, the binary 0 and 1s cannot compete with the qubits of quantum computing. So something that enters on the quantum side, the digital side, which is where we are in classical computing, has no chance of protecting of it and can't even detect it. So detect means that you're picking up on any abnormalities in monitoring and threat hunting. You want to see what's going on, just like it sounds. And then, of course, once you're able to pick that up, hopefully, you have a response. And if there's been any exploit, any degradation in the operations or the performance or the assets, remember we're protecting assets. There's all types of assets. The biggest one that everybody's trying to protect is the data. So data is the new gold, the new economy. But of course, the physical assets are what you have to use to manipulate to get to the data. You have to use your cell phone, you have to use your desktop, you have to use your laptop, you have to use your internet connection and for it to traverse from point A to point B. But the main thing, those are all assets, but the data is the key to it all. So you want to have some backup and recovery strategies. So when you're responding, if there's been any loss of any sort, you can get back to normalcy very quickly. And that's what we call high availability. Although we aspire towards continuous availability, which means there's never an outage. And your strategy we can develop a strategy around that too. But let me just reframe this and you'll see it again. You need governance because the business goals are the driver. You want to make sure that the risk and the way that you approach risk is in alignment with the business goals. Things that are not at the top of the priority of the business goal food chain do not necessarily need as much resources and attention as the ones that are. So governance is of the mind's eye, the lens view, the strategic posture of understanding what those priorities are. You're protecting risk. Let's identify them and do an assessment. Identify them first, protect them. Detect if something comes through, which is very possible. That's why that detect is there. We say every protect may not work all the time. Let's detect it. Let's respond, let's recover. So there is the life cycle approach. Now, we already talked about the concept of the fact that we're using NIST, CSF, and the 2.0 because of the governing function. Before 2.0, governing wasn't considered a function of top priority. What a mistake. It enhances executive accountability and risk oversight because now stuff goes from top down. You have to, anytime you're doing a transformation or you're trying to implement successful, you really do need to have support from the top and let that directive come from the top because stuff rolls downhill. And if you've got the top saying these are our priorities, then it's a lot easier to get the rest of the ecosystem to align with that. And how is that done? Policies, procedures, even roles, responsibility, decision-making from the top down. So always aspire to get your buy-in, your support from the top down. Very important. Great that we have all of these technicians and so forth that can do all of these amazing things. And sometimes those who are not that type feel they don't belong in the conversation. But it's actually the opposite. The human aspect, the people aspect, and the business drivers are what should drive the technology and the technicians. So you want to align cyber governance with enterprise risk management, starting from the top. So governing function has been added in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, which is where we are now. Now, I'll pop back to that in a minute, but let's just look at what an implementation roadmap might look like. You're going to assess the current posture. What is your current state? Get a bit of a baseline performance. You want to define what a target profile should be. This is a little more involved than what you're seeing here, but I just want to get your mind in the right place and give you a thought process, a mindset around what this is all about and how it comes together. Current state, desired state, and do a gap analysis, of course, between the current state and the desired state, step number 3. Prioritize, because the gap can show up, there could be a lot that comes out of that gap. There could be a lot of gaps, but you can't do them all at the same time. You're going to prioritize, and typically based on the risk assessment. Again, we talked earlier that the business, is the main thing. What are the business goals and objectives? So when you factor that in, those top priority things that help to realize those business goals come at the top, and then you map it against the risk, and then you prioritize which ones are really more important. Is it the data center and the power grid infrastructure, or is it the light bulb in the bathroom? Monitor progress and update governance regularly. This is not a one-shot deal, although you'd be surprised how that happens. And in the AI world, more important. So that once a year meeting may not be enough. Once a quarter, okay, but there may need to be some touch points in between because things happen very quickly, particularly in the AI world. And when quantum becomes more prominent, it's going to get even more serious. So let's think of some use case scenario here, nothing too detailed. You want to secure your AI system. So we're mitigating an adversarial attack, which is a particular type of cyber attack, one that is very likely in an AI world. So you want to inventory and classify your AI models and training data. So models is some things that are happening there and some technologies and layers of technology. And then the training data, remember, data is the real goal, garbage in, garbage out. And that's one of the issues with cyber AI, by the way. There's this big conversation about data bias and so forth and so on, which are clear and present. They're true. So if you're putting your training data is not accurate or it's skewed, that in and of itself is an issue. And we're not even talking about cyber. We're just talking about the accuracy of data. But there certainly is layers of cyber components inherent in there that need to be considered. So we got to identify what those are. And if most people just think about how important this is, you come into an organization, the organization says, okay, we're going to be doing AI. Great. Which one? Well, the latest one is Copilot. Hey, let's use Copilot. Now, who in there is saying, well, okay, what kind of model is that? And what is the training data? And, what are the elements and components of it? And how is that going to flow through the ecosystem? And who's asking those questions? I mean, to say Copilot sounds great. It's the latest shiny object out today. Tomorrow it may be something else. But what we're talking about is being able to entertain the level of conversation where you're dissecting what the potential solutions are to realize these business objectives and understand what you're really dealing with. You might need to implement encryption and access control for data. Maybe it's inherent in the model, maybe not. How do you customize the system to ensure that you do have that in there? And then how are you going to detect any drift or abnormalities or adversarial behavior, if you're not doing any of this? If you don't identify, which you're going to establish your baseline, we talked about the roadmap, your current state. How do you know if you're drifting? If there is any, you don't know what's normal from what's abnormal. So this process is critical. And then, of course, you want to develop a strategy for response. And since we're talking about the topic of AI, an AI strategy would be great once it's vetted out, because then you can have an automated response. And of course, AI is really a predictive system. So with the predictive system can look at patterns and trends and understand what should happen next, a lot of times quicker than a person. But you got to make sure that the data and the logic is correct, because it can also give you a prediction that's grossly inaccurate or wrong. And then that's a whole nother system, a situation in itself. But long and short is this flow, this process is critical. There needs to be a response. AI-driven response would be ideal, because that's the world we live in today. Ensure you have bias testing and so forth and all of that. So I have controls down at the bottom, and I put governance at the bottom. We know governance actually starts at the top because it's driving all of these other things based on business, the business drivers. But here we're controlling, and we're bumping that up against our governance. And again, now we're introducing the 42001, right? We're going to have some convergence here in just a moment. So what's this 42001? It's the first global AI management standard. By the way, I'm one of the instructors for implementing 42001. So those of you who want to get more up to speed on that, PCB does offer this certification, and I am one of the instructors for this training. Very, very detailed training, very involved. You come out of this, you will understand what's going on after it all sinks in. It's a lot. But what we want to do with this is to ensure trustworthy AI. And again, the governance is the anchor, systematic governance, right? Not just any old type of governance, but we do just have any old versus none, but there needs to be a systematic approach. And there's 4 pillars. We want, one pillar is the AI policy and objectives. We've got risk management. Of course, we talked about in that risk management, we got to account for bias. We got to account for security, but yet there does need to be some transparency. So it's a delicate balance there. We want controls, life cycle controls. This is from development to decommissioning every step of the way. And we need to be evaluating performance when? All the time, real time, every time. This is a fast moving target, and you don't just set it and forget it. So again, the mapping, where do these worlds come together? Bridging the gap. This is a long and deep conversation, guys. There's no way we're going to cover every aspect, every element of it here today. But I just want to kind of whet your appetite. I want to sensitize you that this is an issue, cybersecurity, and particularly with the advent of artificial intelligence. And that there is a standard or a confluence of standards that we can use to guide our thinking and our approach to being able to manage this space. We're almost there. So we talked a little bit about NIST. We talked briefly about the ISO 4200. That's a deep dive. So I'm not even going to try to unpack that can of worms here, but I'll give you the skinny on it. Cybersecurity risk mitigation. We talked about that for the cybersecurity framework. That's the NIST standard 2.0 current with governance at the top. And it lines up because ISO is about system governance, specifically AI system governance. They call it management systems. And a lot of times people look at it, they don't even don't realize it focuses on AI. But I'm telling you, this is AI systems governance. So if you want to really get your mind's eye around the confluence between AI and cyber, make sure you jump into our 42000-001. That's where you're going to get that. The scope, you have information technology and operational technology on NIST. That's everything. And then, of course, with the 4200, it's very specific to AI, which is what you want in this day and age. And there aren't a lot of entities that have done the work to understand how to wrap systems in AI and what the considerations are and how to roll it out and with the consideration of governance. It just doesn't exist. AI is too new and it's changing every day. But that's exactly what the 42001 does. It's a certifiable standard. The NIST is voluntary, but it's used in a lot of regulations, which means you have to do it. They insert a lot of the NIST in there. ISO gets put in there a lot too, various forms of the ISO standard. Okay, so the overlap, address the supply chain, very big deal. So we're talking about systems in the environment in which you work, but there's a lot that has to happen for you to actually, in that business environment, to use those systems. There's a lot of moving parts. There's the hardware technology itself. There's the infrastructure. There's the apps. There's everything that's flowing at data and rest, data in motion, and everything in between. A lot of moving parts in there. And those components and the supply chain to get them from where they originate, even if it's a developer somewhere, to implementation. And we have to be vetting it out. We have to have policies and procedures and governance every step of the way and ensure that everybody in your supply chain is complying with this and is up to speed with it. So that's an entire ecosystem that has to be looked at. So from theory to action, it's a lot of good theory. I think you kind of get the idea. Of course, we can talk more about it moving forward, but let me just plant the seed a little further so we can bring it home. You want to assess the gaps in your current cyber and AI practices, which is a moving target. AI is moving every day, but you want to standardize. That's the purpose of governance. You want to define the scope. Where are we going? Prioritize high-risk AI systems. You want to map control with the convergence of the cybersecurity framework and the ISO 42001. And there's other things out there too. I just want to simplify this conversation, because if we go into any one of those and unpack them, there's cans and cans and cans of worms under each one of these alone. But let's keep this conversation simple at this point. Depending on the complexity of the environment you're dealing with, you may have to go a little deeper. This is just the executive briefing. You want to train teams on AI and cyber risk, and you want to audit. You don't just set it and forget it. You got to keep your finger on the pulse every step of the way and continuously monitor. So if you look here, even though we're looking at the NIST and the ISO, certain ones of these standards speaks to certain elements of the flow more or less. So that's what we're looking at here, is which one is optimal for what step in the plan. There's an advantage to doing this, reduced risk, because we're going to be proactive in our cyber and AI threat management. Compliance to regulations. If we apply these standards the right way, we will be in compliance with regulations, which are must-dos. Competitive advantage. Not everybody's doing it because they don't understand it. They don't necessarily know how to approach it or go about it. So you're going to be ahead of the competition, and it actually saves you money because you're going to be less vulnerable than your competitors. So what we want to do is make sure you audit for regulation for readiness. You do your supply chain risk management. You get cyber insurance if necessary, have incident response, and transform your governance. Your next step here, and we're at the end. Conduct a readiness assessment according to this converged standard set of the Cybersecurity Framework and ISO 42001. You want to start with your high impact AI use cases, those customer facing use cases, chat bots and whatever else you're using the customer is interacting with. You want to leverage your existing InfoSec teams to scale for governance. You don't have one, put one together, subcontract out, get one. This is serious business. This is getting more serious as AI becomes more prominent, which is every day, and quantum computing is right on its heels. Okay. All right, that was a bit of a discussion. I hope you got a lot of it. It's not just a case of IT, it's a business imperative. To certify the framework as your strategic ally, we can discuss further at your convenience. I am Dr. Mike Crawley, and that's my story.